to Classic Film, Montgomery, Clift, and Other Great Actors podcasts. Don't forget, you can always check out these podcasts in blog form on my website by searching Classic Film, Montgomery, Clift, and Other Great Actors. Today we are going to talk about Richard Widmark. Richard Widmark, Life Not Imitating Art. There's lots of video clips on the Richard Widmark blog, but will not be contained in this podcast. I highly recommend you go to the blog and check out the video clips because they really show what kind of a great actor Richard Widmark was. Raised on movies since the age of 3, Richard Widmark was predestined to be a film star. He burst onto the Hollywood scene in his first movie role, playing one of the most despicable characters ever. Despite the fact that his film career is littered with hateful villains, the real Richard Widmark seems to be the complete opposite. Or is he? Richard Widmark's childhood. Richard was born December 26, 1914, in Sunrise Township, Minnesota, to a Swedish father, Carl, and a Scottish/English mother, Ethel May. He had one younger brother, Donald. Richard grew up in South Dakota and Illinois, moving quite often because of his father's job as a traveling salesman. Richard's grandmother, Mary, was a huge movie buff and constantly took Richard to the movies from the age of 3 onward. Richard fell in love with the movies and would often act out scenes from the films with his brother and friends. He was also an excellent musician, playing both the piano and the drums. The nomadic lifestyle wasn't easy on Richard, his only stable and constant friend being his brother Donald. There was also a lot of religious ambiguity in the Widmark household, the boys being exposed to different religions depending on the family member. I believe this instability in his childhood would cause him to develop certain personality traits in his adulthood. The family did eventually settle down in Princeton, Illinois, where the boys were able to complete high school. Richard was very intelligent and was looking to pursue a career in the law. However, his father could not afford to send him to college. Luckily, due to his excellent academic record and his talent on the football field, Richard was offered a full scholarship to Lake Forest College, which would completely change his life. Richard Widmark's two great loves. At Lake Forest College, Richard's life was completely transformed by two things. The first was his participation in the drama program at the college, which he did at the suggestion of a friend. He was in several plays over the course of his time at the college, and his talent was recognized almost immediately. Richard realized that his future was not in law after all, and instead concentrated on acting. He would in fact continue on as teacher in speech and dramatics at Lake Forest College after graduating. Richard would also become involved with Jean Hazelwood, who was studying journalism and who he had dated previously for a short time. Jean would become the most significant part of his life, as they would be married 55 years until her death. Jean would go on to become a screenwriter and would sometimes work on the screenplays of Richard's films. Richard Widmark, radio personality. While teaching at Lake Forest, Richard would also work on the radio and on the stage. He actually had a very successful career in radio. Anyone who has heard his voice can see why he might have been popular. Not only did he have a beautiful speaking voice, but he was able to put on different voices to create characters. He would go on to star in many radio programs from 1938 into the late 1940s. Richard seemed to look back fondly on this period of his life, though he did not care for living in New York. He preferred country life, animals over people, nature over architecture. Family was his most important focus, and he was about to be dealt a severe blow in that regard. World War II, a great tragedy. Richard was anxious to sign up to fight in World War II. Unfortunately, or fortunately, he was not allowed to join up because he had a severe ear problem. Officially called a perforated eardrum, it was a serious condition that would plague Richard throughout his life and left him with little hearing ability in that ear. However, brother Donald had no such problems and joined the Army Air Corps. While flying on a mission in February 1944 Donald's plane was attacked and the airmen had to parachute to safety. The blast from the plane caused Donald's parachute to catch on fire. Donald had a very bad landing and sustained a head injury. The survivors were sent to a prison camp where they remained until May 1945. Richard and family first received word that Donald was missing, then eventually that he was a POW. When Donald returned home, however, all was not well. He was suffering from severe headaches, although he was given a clean bill of health from the armed forces. Donald's health continued to decline until it was discovered that he was suffering from a brain tumor. He did have operations to try to remove the tumor, but he would eventually become paralyzed and needed full-time care. Richard paid for his brother's care, and Donald died in 1955. Just one of the many war veterans who give everything for their country and is relegated to a footnote in the story of actor Richard Widmark. The Kiss of Success? Despite the chaos with Donald, there were some good things happening to Richard in the mid-1940s. The first was the birth of his daughter Anne on July 25, 1945, just a month after Donald's release from the prison camp. Secondly was his first movie part. Richard was signed by Darryl Zanuck at 20th Century Fox for a 7-year contract after seeing him in the play Dreamgirl. Zanuck wanted to cast him as Tommy Udo in Fox's upcoming film Kiss of Death. Director Henry Hathaway was completely against it. He thought Richard looked far too intelligent to pull off the role of a vicious gangster. Zanuck insisted, and Hathaway treated Richard quite poorly throughout production as a result. Hathaway was dead wrong. Richard Widmark not only pulled off the character, but created a huge sensation in his first film ever. His portrayal was shocking to audiences, not just for the actions of the character, but more so for the psychological effect. In fact, when researching, I was constantly pointed to this particular performance and specifically the laugh. Richard was nominated for his first and only Oscar, Best Supporting, for the unforgettable Tommy Udo. To say Tommy Udo made Richard Widmark a star is probably understating the fact. An unfortunate side effect of this role, and others to come, was the public had a very difficult time separating Richard Widmark from Tommy Udo and would sometimes even attack him when they would see him out in public. Luckily, Richard didn't just play tough guys, he was pretty tough and could generally take care of himself. There are video clips on the blog for Kiss of Death if you'd like to go on and see them. We start out by seeing our hero, Victor Mature, in jail with a vicious criminal, Tommy Udo. Tommy takes a liking to Victor's character. Richard does put on a different voice for Tommy. There's a scene, one of the most shocking scenes in film, especially in the 1940s. As I mentioned before, it's the laugh that seems to resonate with the audiences, even today. Now, this was not a put-on laugh, but it is the way Richard actually laughed, maybe slightly exaggerated for this role. Richard saw parts of this film and was horrified by the way he looked, stating he didn't want to smile again in a film for 2 years afterwards. When asked about the laugh in later years, Richard would say he thought the character was such a beast that it was funny. It should be noted that Victor Mature was a big star in film at this point, and he is almost completely overshadowed by Richard Widmark in a rather small role in this film. Richard Widmark, bad guy roles. Naturally, after the phenomenal success of the character of Tommy Udo, Richard was put in more bad guy roles. His next film was The Street with No Name, 1948, playing a gangster named Alex Stiles. Even though Richard is playing another gangster, the character is not the same as Tommy Udo. This is a more sophisticated, authoritative criminal, one that Richard would go on to perfect, where Tommy Udo seems to be a psychopath. Stiles is more a sociopath, a charming fellow but clearly dangerous. Richard is one of the best at being able to bring charm and danger at the same time. I personally find Alec more terrifying than Tommy because Alec is more understated, where Tommy just seems obvious. Richard would continue with his charming but dangerous characters in his next film, Roadhouse, 1948. Again, we see another subtle character difference. Jeffy, Richard's character, is not a smoothly controlled violent gangster, but a spoiled man who becomes unhinged when he cannot get his way. This speaks to Richard's acting talent to give different nuances to the characters. Roadhouse is another film where there are video clips on the blog. Jeffy is a manager of a nightclub and has hired Lily, Ida Lupino, as a singer. He also has designs on her, but she is not interested. He believes she will eventually succumb to his charm and continues to woo her and not be put off by her obvious disinterest. Jeffy's longtime friend Pete Cornell Wilde is the manager and the bookkeeper of the club. While Jeffy is away on a hunting trip, Pete and Lily discover their love for each other and decide to get married. Unfortunately, Jeffy has gotten a marriage license in order to marry Lily himself, without her consent. Pete has to explain this situation to Jeffy. Jeffy decides to frame Pete by telling the cops he stole some money from the club. This results in a trial where Pete is convicted. However, Jeffy asks the judge to release Pete to him for probation rather than jail. He does this because he wants to control Pete and Lily and make their lives miserable. He forces them to go on a trip with him to his cabin, gets drunk, and continues to play games with them. Pete and Lily manage to escape Jeffy, but he comes after them. Ida Lupino puts forth an excellent performance in this film as well. Richard then made a western, Yellow Sky, 1948, playing one of a gang of outlaws. His character is a dissenter-type fellow, always challenging the head of the group, Gregory Peck, and generally stirring up trouble. Though still playing a kind of bad guy, he's at least away from the gangster roles, which I think helped him from being typecast into that sort of role. Richard could well have continued on as bad guys throughout his entire career, but yet again, Daryl Zanuck stepped in to help. He gave him the role of Dan Lunsford in Down the Sea in Ships, 1949, which gave him his first good guy role. Ironically, Henry Hathaway was director on this film and again did not want Richard Widmark in the role. Why Henry Hathaway appeared unable to recognize the versatility and talent of Richard was a mystery, but he did eventually go on to have a good relationship with the actor. On the Studio System roller coaster, 1950 to 1954. The studio system was a nightmare for most actors, signing them on for 7 years and then forcing them to be in numerous productions in order to justify their weekly salary. Actors got paid their salaries whether working or not, so the studios wanted them working at all times to make sure they weren't getting the shaft. Actors had little to no say over the films they were put into. This was a major issue with many actors during the studio system period. Richard was lucky in that he was generally put in good roles and films and was not typecast. The studio would attempt to renegotiate his contract to give him a raise, which would then tack on another 7 years to the contract. Richard was smart enough to avoid this, although he did admit to being tempted by the large amounts of money. Many other stars got trapped this way and wound up in terrible films. Richard was the kind of actor that worked well under the system. He was very professional and prepared for his roles, timely, and didn't need numerous takes or rehearsals for his scenes. This, however, did create issues with directors and or actors down the line, as he expected the same sort of behavior from them as well. Richard started out the 1950s with several great films, the first being Night and the City, 1950, perhaps one of his best roles. This is a different kind of character for Richard, not a good guy or a bad guy, but somewhere in between. His Harry Fabian is a sort of con artist, but is always trying to find some get-rich-quick scheme to make something of himself. There's video clips of Night and the City on the blog. Harry works for a nightclub as kind of a promoter to bring in business. Harry has a scheme to become a wrestling promoter in London, trying to take over the current gangster controlling the wrestling, Christo. In fact, he is using Christo's own father in this scheme. He only needs money. He tries to get money from the club owner, who laughs at him but agrees to match $200 if he can find it. This seems impossible, except the owner's wife, Googie Withers, has stashed away some money and is now looking to help herself through Harry. Everything is going really well for Harry, but he has no idea he's being manipulated and tricked by the club owner, Francis Sullivan, because he believes Harry is having an affair with his wife. Richard plays Harry in a very tightly wound manner. He's anxious and excitable. When things turn for Harry, he becomes extremely desperate, and Richard plays that superbly as well. This is close to, if not, his best performance in my book. In the end, his desperation and ambition wind up destroying him. Not even the lovely Jean Tierney, who plays his long-suffering and devoted girlfriend, can save him. I do want to note that Night in the City was a British film, filmed in London but produced by 20th Century Fox. This and another film we will discuss later are, in my opinion, Richard's two best performances, and both filmed in England. Richard's next film was Panic in the Streets 1950, with Elia Kazan directing. Richard wasn't much on directors in general, but he did have high praise for Elia Kazan, specifically considering him an actor's director. Elia had just as much praise for Richard Widmark, saying, quote, "Dick was a very real, down-to-earth fellow. It was the first picture in a long time where he wasn't playing the villain. He played a nice person in Panic, and he was like that." End quote. Kazan by Elia Kazan. Unrelated to Richard Widmark, but to my own personal amusement, Elia goes on to say later in his book, quote, "The only one I didn't like that much was Paul Douglas. He really wasn't an actor, you know. He had been a football announcer. He was a front man. He should have been the host of a steak joint." End quote. It was nice that Richard was able to play a nice guy in Panic, because he was about to play the most despicable of all his characters, and there were quite a lot to choose from. However, none were quite as horrible as racist Ray Biddle from No Way Out 1950. No Way Out. Richard did not want to do this film. He was appalled at the character's racism. However, he was under contract and a professional, so he took the role. He starred with newcomer Sidney Poitier, who was forced to endure numerous racist tirades from Richard's character. Horrified after every take, Richard would apologize profusely to Sidney, who would remind Richard that they were just acting. There are video clips on the blog from No Way Out. Ray has been shot while committing a holdup, and he and his brother are brought to the hospital for care. However, there is something very wrong with his brother, and Dr. Brooks, Sidney, is trying to get to the bottom of it. Before he has the chance to finish the testing, the brother has died. Ray is convinced the doctor murdered his brother and refuses to have an autopsy, which might exonerate Dr. Brooks. Dr. Brooks and his colleague find the brother's ex-wife, Linda Darnell, in the hopes she might be able to help. She visits Ray to try to help, but we find there is a history between them. Ray manages to escape and tracks down Dr. Brooks. However, he re-injures his leg. Richard was always very good at appearing to be in great pain. Despite the dreadful lines he had to say to Sidney, Richard would become friends with Sidney and would make several more movies with him. Sidney would go on to say, quote, "The reality of Widmark was 1,000 miles from the characters he played. That shy, gentle, very private person helped me to learn the ropes of filmmaking and was among the first in Hollywood, along with his lovely wife Jean, to open his home to me socially." End quote. This Life by Sidney Poitier. In 1952, Richard Widmark was in a film with Marilyn Monroe called Don't Bother to Knock. A lesser-known Marilyn film, it is nevertheless possibly her best acting performance. Richard was less than taken with Marilyn. This was not surprising considering his perfectionism with the script and his performances. Marilyn was difficult to work with, though not intentionally. She suffered from severe and unrelieved anxiety when it came to acting and was often too afraid to leave her dressing room. Richard had little patience for this kind of thing. He was prepared from day one, letter perfect at all times, and ready to shoot and be done with it. He did not consider her a good actor and would say, quote, "On the set you'd think, oh, this is impossible. You can't print this. You'd see it, and she's got everyone backed off the screen. Laurence Olivier said the same thing. She had that phenomenal something." End quote. Becoming Richard Widmark by Bartlett Lee Kassabaum. He didn't hate Marilyn, though, despite how difficult it was to work with her. Richard did have some understanding, saying, quote, "I was very fond of her. She was a nice girl, but she was a damaged girl." End quote. Becoming Richard Widmark by Bartlett Lee Kassabaum. As he mentioned, Richard Widmark, usually with such great screen presence, is reduced to a mere second fiddle next to Marilyn's very realistic performance of a severely mentally ill woman. It's said that she simply emulated her own mother, who was a paranoid schizophrenic. Richard's next big film was Pickup on South Street, 1953, where he plays yet another not completely bad, not completely good con artist type. This time his character is a pickpocket. Richard had a number of films under his belt and, as mentioned, had little use for directors. He began to have some cockiness to him when dealing with directors. Specifically, Sam Fuller would ask him to do a scene a certain way, and Richard would disagree and do it the way he wanted to. Richard always had a good grasp of his character and knew what he wanted to do with them. He felt he really didn't need much direction. This would give him a bit of a reputation about being difficult with directors, and if they didn't stand up to him, he would walk all over them. Sam Fuller did stand up to him by telling Richard they wouldn't proceed with the scene because he wasn't taking direction. That put a quick stop to Richard's antics, and he would thereafter work better with the director. Pickup on South Street is a very steamy, sexy film, and his on-screen chemistry with Jean Peters is really something. His character is cocky, smug, manipulative, and sexy all rolled into one. He seems uncaring, but as the film progresses, you can see evidence he does care and does have a good heart, though trying desperately to disguise it. Pickup on South Street. There are video clips from Pickup on South Street on the blog. Richard plays Skip McCoy, who is a 3-time loser pickpocket. He steals a wallet out of a girl's purse on the subway and winds up with some important government film that is being sold to the communists. The feds, working alongside the cops, are trying to recover the film. In addition, the girl who is carrying the film, Jean Peters, is sent by her boyfriend to try to get the film back. The girl, Candy, is really not aware of who she's been carrying the film for. Skip continues to hold out for more money because he knows how much value the film has. Skip is a mercurial guy, blowing hot and cold, but there is some sense that he might be dangerous when pushed. Also in this film is Thelma Ritter, who gives a good performance as the world-weary informant selling ties and information. She is friendly with Skip, but has sold him out to both the cops and Candy for money. She does draw the line at dealing with the communists. Candy's boyfriend Joe eventually has to take over the search for the film, and he is prepared to shoot Skip and whoever else is in his way. Candy won't give Joe Skip's address because she's fallen in love with Skip and she winds up in the hospital. Richard was in several other films during this time period, ending with Broken Lance 1954, which was his last film under contract with 20th Century Fox. Richard Widmark, Freelancer, 1955 to 1960. Some folks did find it hard once they left the studio system to find work. Richard was not one of those. Shortly after leaving 20th Century Fox, he formed his own production company called Heath Productions, which would produce some of his later films. After a little stint on I Love Lucy, he began to work on a star-studded film for MGM called The Cobweb, 1955. Despite the phenomenal cast of Gloria Grahame, Charles Boyer, Lillian Gish, Lauren Bacall, and John Kerr, this film falls short of greatness. The acting is superb, but the story is thin and the characters aren't properly fleshed out. Richard is wonderful in this film, playing a psychiatrist. The Cobweb. There are video clips from The Cobweb on the blog. Richard plays Dr. Stuart MacGyver, a progressive psychiatrist who works at a home for mentally ill folks. He has set up a patient government system that lets the patients feel they have some control over their lives. He is very much beloved by the patients, especially a very young, very neurotic man named Stevie, John Kerr, who sees him as a father figure. The whole conflict in this movie is over some drapes. The patients want to make the drapes themselves. However, unbeknownst to Dr. MacGyver, his wife, Gloria Grahame, also has plans to get new drapes for the establishment. She has tried to tell Dr. MacGyver, but he never seems to have the time to listen to her, and she feels neglected. In taking care of the drapes, she has stepped on the toes of the administrator, Lillian Gish, who is quite resentful about it. In the film, we see how badly fractured Dr. MacGyver's marriage is and how much both Dr. MacGyver and his wife are suffering. Unfortunately, the problem of the drapes has turned into a weird power struggle now since Mrs. MacGyver has gone to Dr. MacGyver's partner, Dr. Dev, Charles Boyer, and used her feminine wiles on him. Dr. Dev posts a memo saying the patients will not make the drapes, which causes Stevie to become angry and destructive. Dr. MacGyver deals perfectly with Stevie. Run for the Sun, 1956. This isn't an especially impressive movie in any way, except that I really like Richard and his character in this. I also like Trevor Howard, who co-stars along with Jane Greer. The story itself is rather unbelievable, and Richard did not care for this film at all. In fact, he would say that he would force the children to watch it when they were bad. What children he means, I don't know, since he only had one child, but maybe some other kids would come over, I'm not sure. Richard plays Mike Latimer, an author, hiding out in Mexico. Jane Greer is a reporter who has come looking for him to do a story on him. However, it's an undercover type assignment where he is unaware she is doing a story. Mike Latimer runs into her in a bar and she talks about him, pretending not to know who he is. However, he is not fooled by this. Admittedly, it's a very strange premise wherein they wind up crashing while Richard is flying Jane to another city. They are rescued by Trevor, but realizing, unfortunately, that he's a wanted war criminal holed up with other criminals. For some reason, Richard decides to make a speech, making it obvious that he knows what's going on, which then forces Trevor and the criminals to have to eliminate them. Note, I'm obviously not listing every single Richard Widmark film. He made 72 films altogether, and it's just not possible to go into detail on every single film, so I'm just highlighting the ones I like or the ones I think he gives important performances in. I've not seen all his films. If there's a film I missed, please feel free to mention it in the comments. The Tunnel of Love, 1958. This was another film Richard did not particularly like. He wasn't impressed with his own performance in the film and questioned why he did the film. He was actually a last-minute replacement after Glenn Ford dropped out. I wanted to put this film in because someone told me recently that Richard Widmark is the same in every role. Although, based on what I've already mentioned, we know that isn't so, but I wanted to add a film that shows something completely different from Richard. This is a comedic film, which is a rarity for him. Though he does look a little less comfortable in this kind of film, he does not do a poor job at it in my opinion. It's probably not his forte, but had he continued to try comedies, I think he could have had some success. It doesn't help that the script on this particular film is rubbish, and Doris Day also hated the script and the film. Richard plays Augie, who is married to a soldie. Doris Day, they are trying to adopt a baby, but all sorts of things go awry when a woman from the agency visits. Gia Scala. But Augie is unaware she's from the agency. He gives a bad impression and ruins their chances, at least that's what he thinks. Meanwhile, his friend, Gig Young, has given him a job. A situation has arisen with the agency woman that requires Augie to give her $1,000, which Gig Young has arranged to withhold from his salary. Unfortunately, Doris Day has noticed the discrepancy and wants to know what's going on. There are clips from this movie on my blog if you want to check out Richard doing some comic acting. Warlock, 1959. Warlock has a special place in my heart because it's the film that made me love Richard Widmark. He plays a hoodlum turned good guy deputy in this western and holds his own quite effectively against acting great Henry Fonda. In fact, I love Henry Fonda and Richard Widmark together in film. Anthony Quinn is also in this film as Henry Fonda's friend. Richard plays Johnny, a hoodlum that hangs around with a gang of men that terrorize the people of Warlock. They constantly run new sheriffs out of town, and the townspeople resort to hiring a professional killer, Clay, Henry Fonda. A stagecoach comes in and the gang hijacks it, but a passenger is killed from a bullet in the hills. We see the culprit is actually Clay's friend Tom, Anthony Quinn, but the gang is blamed for the shooting, and in specific, Johnny's brother. Clay runs the boys out of town, but they return, and Clay is forced to duel with Johnny's brother, killing him. The townspeople are worried about Clay, but can't find anyone to volunteer as sheriff, so Johnny, who is sick of the lawlessness, agrees to be the deputy sheriff. This puts him at odds with his previous gang, who intend to come into Warlock and revenge Johnny's brother's death. They want Johnny to say that Clay shot Johnny's brother for no reason, but Johnny knows that isn't true and refuses to go along with him. The gang winds up injuring his hand. Now with his hand injured, Johnny is in a bad spot to stop the gang from coming into Warlock, but he insists on continuing forward with it, despite the fact he will likely be killed. He has a friend in the gang, Curly, played by DeForest Kelley, who tries to come and warn him. Johnny manages to take care of the gang problem with help from Curly, but then another incident occurs with Clay. Clay has suffered a tragedy and is wreaking havoc on the town. Johnny has to confront him and tell him to leave town. Clay refuses, and Johnny is faced with another duel with one of the fastest professional gunmen out there. Another note about this film from Edward Dmytryk, director, mentions that Richard had a lot of conflict in the film with Dorothy Malone, who played his love interest. He mentions how Dorothy was distracted and not committed to her role. We know how that bothers Richard. And furthermore, when rehearsing a slap, really hauled off and whacked Richard. Richard was angry and told her it was rehearsal and that was his bad ear, and if she felt she had to slap him during rehearsal to hit the other ear. Nevertheless, when the next rehearsal came, she hauled off and slapped him again in the same ear. Richard reacted by punching her so hard she flew across the room. Edward would also say, quote, Dick is an extremely conscientious workman, a study in concentration and creative irritability, and has a very short fuse, end quote. It's a hell of a life and not a bad living by Edward Dmytryk. 1960 to 1970. The Alamo, 1960. This short fuse of Richard's was again put to the test in his next film, The Alamo, which was being directed by John Wayne. John had originally wanted Richard for the role of Davy Crockett, but Richard preferred the role of Jim Bowie. John was not especially interested in Richard playing Jim Bowie, who was supposed to stand about 6'6". He didn't think Richard was big enough to play the part. Richard prevailed, however, and I don't think the lack of height bothered any single moviegoer. Richard was quickly disillusioned with the script. He found it not factual enough, and John Wayne as a director, or in general. Richard and John did not get along. At one point, John referred to Richard as a little shit, which caused Richard to challenge him to a fight. John was immediately confused, wanting to know why Richard was acting that way. When pointed out that he had called Richard a little shit, John was bewildered, claiming he had said no such thing. When everyone had gotten Richard to calm down, John said to a crew member, who was well within Richard's hearing, "Feisty little shit, isn't he?" Despite their dislike and differences, they were both professional enough to get the film made. Richard's Bowie is wonderful, a wild frontiersman who doesn't take orders from anyone and is constantly causing problems for Colonel Barrett in charge at the Alamo, played by Lawrence Harvey. The tension between Barrett and Bowie is long-running throughout the film, and both actors play off each other beautifully. Lost in the shuffle, however, is John Wayne's Davy Crockett, who seems stilted, awkward, and it's John Wayne who seems miscast rather than Richard Widmark. There are some clips from the Alamo on the blog. A Mexican army has sent a little regiment to inform the army at the Alamo that they should abandon the Alamo. Colonel Barrett has an answer for them that's very clear. While at the Alamo, a message comes for Jim telling him his wife is dead. Richard's emotion in this scene is impressive, and you can see John Wayne looking awkward, though perhaps that's what the scene is called for. When it becomes known that no reinforcements are coming to the Alamo to assist the army there, Colonel Barrett gives a speech releasing Jim's men and Davy's men. Jim has already planned to take his men and leave, but at the last moment he decides to stand by Colonel Barrett, which is the most moving scene in the film, and Lawrence Harvey reacts beautifully. In 1961, Richard made Two Rode Together for John Ford, co-starring Jimmy Stewart and Shirley Jones. Richard was anxious to make a film for John Ford as he considered him a great director. However, Richard knew John Ford was difficult and was not going to back down for him. Jimmy Stewart was another matter entirely. He was a very professional actor, and Richard had no trouble working with him. In fact, Richard liked to joke that neither he, nor Jimmy, nor John Ford could hear very well, and a lot of their conversation would just be a series of "what?" from one to the other. Richard did respect John Ford as a director, very rare for Richard, but both he and Jimmy thought at this point John Ford was much less invested than he used to be and perhaps a little past his prime. Richard got along quite well with his leading lady, Shirley Jones. Richard liked to say that he never even flirted with another woman because he happened to like his wife. Shirley Jones tells a different story. She talks about rides into the countryside, which would turn into makeout sessions. She does mention that they, quote, never went all the way, end quote. She makes it sound like it was more her decision than his. She states that Richard had said to her in one of these makeout sessions, quote, "Don't worry, we are both married, and I'm not going to take advantage of you. You're 20 years younger than I am, you've got children, and I really care about you. But, under different circumstances," end quote. Shirley Jones, a memoir by Shirley Jones. Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961. Another star-studded affair was Judgment in Nuremberg, starring an actor Richard really admired and studied, Spencer Tracy. Also in this film were a host of talented actors, Maximilian Schell, Montgomery Clift, Judy Garland, Marlene Dietrich, and Burt Lancaster. Richard played the prosecuting attorney, a role originally offered to Montgomery Clift, who turned it down because he didn't find the role interesting. He instead wanted the role of special needs witness Rudolph Peterson. Both Richard and Max Schell do a wonderful job playing off each other as opposing attorneys. Richard brings across a real intensity, which makes you wonder if he was remembering his brother's life being cut short because of the Nazis. There were many Oscar nominations for this film, but sadly none for Richard, who was just as deserving as anyone else in the film. In fact, Stanley Kramer, director, details this point perfectly in his autobiography. Quote, Richard Widmark was properly praised for his performance as the prosecutor of the 4 defendants, but he attracted less attention than he deserved. Even though his was a major role, it was also thankless because it was less dramatic or spectacular than others in the film, but we would have been at a loss without him. End quote. It's a Mad, Mad World by Stanley Kramer. Perhaps Montgomery Clift, who was nominated for an Academy Award for his role in this film, was correct in his initial assessment of the role. Nevertheless, Richard does an excellent job in this film. There are video clips from Judgment at Nuremberg in the blog. Richard plays Colonel Lawson, who is the prosecuting attorney. Colonel Lawson is especially upset after witness Rudolph Peterson, Montgomery Clift's, testimony and gets drunk. He runs into Judge Hayward, Spencer Tracy, and shows just how he feels about the matter. There's a particularly disturbing scene where Colonel Lawson is showing footage of the horrors of the Holocaust. You can see the emotion being held back in his eyes. Colonel Lawson is informed near the end of the trial that the political powers in America do not want the publicity of these defendants being convicted due to uncertain Cold War relations. He is basically told to back off and therefore is forced to turn the responsibility for the verdict over to the judges. He's clearly upset at having to do this. Call me biased, but I think Richard's performance in this film was very Oscar-worthy, and I'm not taking anything away from Max Schell's performance, which was great also and did win the Oscar. But Stanley is right about the difference in the performances. Max was far more dramatic with his performance, where Richard subtly showed his intensity and emotional turbulence. In my opinion, hinting at emotion is much more difficult than overtly displaying it. Richard was part of another ensemble cast in his next film, the great epic How the West Was Won, 1962. This was the first film I saw Richard in and absolutely hated him. His Mike King is just as mean, bossy, and despicable as almost any of his other roles, perhaps except Ray Biddle. Richard again gets to act with Henry Fonda in his small portion of this film and with George Peppard. This is a wonderful film, which is about every famous actor from this time period, and I would highly recommend it, although Richard has an extremely small part in it. Cheyenne Autumn 1964 was another John Ford film. Richard played another good guy role of a soldier who tries to help the Indians as they make their way back to their homeland in defiance of the law. The Bedford Incident 1965. Remember earlier when I said Richard's 2 best performances came in British films? Hopefully you are still with me, because this is the other film to which I was referring, where I might say that it's a shame that Richard was not nominated for an Oscar for Judgment in Nuremberg. It is a travesty that he was not nominated for the Bedford Incident. Richard is reunited with old friend Sidney Poitier in this film, but the film belongs 100% to Richard Widmark. He is again playing a bad guy, a naval captain, power-hungry and demanding complete obedience by the entire ship. He never lets up on the men, driving them to a state of constant anxiety. He's obsessed with finding these Russian submarines and forcing them to also obey his will. Ben Munsford, Sidney Poitier, and Lieutenant Commander Chester Potter, Martin Balsam, had been flown by helicopter to the Bedford, a ship commanded by Captain Eric Finlander, Richard. Ben is there to do an article on Captain Eric, and Chester is there as the new medical officer. Captain Eric wants neither there. Ben meets with the captain and finds a Commodore from the Nazi regime. Eric Portman is now working with Captain Eric. Eric bullies everyone on ship with the possible exception of the Commodore. Ben asks to interview Eric, but Eric doesn't care much for his questions. Captain Eric will go to any lengths to assert his dominance over the Russians. Even the Commodore is alarmed at his obsessive behavior. Eric Portman is the next best thing in this film after Richard Widmark. The 2 of them work perfectly together. Captain Eric has his staff wound so tightly they are dangerous. He must have the upper hand with the Russians at any cost, despite being warned to stop. His obsession seems to be verging into madness. Captain Eric finally has to pay the price for his ego, and he knows it. His face at the end of this film says it all. I would just add that I highly, highly recommend this film. This is a quality film with great acting and will leave you feeling stunned. And after you have seen this film, please come back and tell me in the comments whether or not you felt this was an Oscar-worthy role. In 1968, Richard did a film, Madigan, which would be spun off into a television series in the early 1970s. I've not seen Madigan, so please feel free to tell me your thoughts in the comments. 1970s to 1990s. Richard continued acting into the 1990s. Some films of note in this period are Murder on the Orient Express, 1974, The Domino Principle, 1977, Coma, 1978, The Swarm, 1978, and A Gathering of Old Men, 1987. His last film was True Colors, 1991. In the blog I mentioned about how good Richard is at screaming. I put some examples on the blog of clips of him screaming, so if you want to go and check them out, you're welcome to. Richard Widmark and family. In 1969, Richard and Jean's daughter Anne married professional baseball player Sandy Koufax. She remained married to him until 1982 when they divorced. They had no children. Jean passed away in 1997 after a battle with Alzheimer's disease. Richard would remarry in 1999 to family friend Susan Blanchard, who was the stepdaughter to Oscar Hammerstein III and ex-wife of Henry Fonda. Richard would suffer a fall in 2007, injuring his back. He would slowly decline until March 24, 2008, when he died at the age of 93 years old. Richard Widmark is a bit of a paradox. Numerous sources mention what a nice person he was, very kind and professional, yet he is also described as difficult, hot-tempered, and arrogant. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's hard to imagine there didn't exist within Richard something that brought these vicious and despicable characters to the surface. Yet Richard was an advocate against guns and violence. He played authoritative characters, yet was often described as shy, aloof, and soft-spoken. Perhaps the reason it's so hard to pin down Richard Widmark is the fact that he was a very private person who didn't tend to discuss his personal life. Gary Merrill talks about a story Richard used to tell about his dad, Carl Widmark. His dad would go down to the local movie theater whenever Richard was in a movie and ask the manager, "Say, how's my boy doing?" "Well, Mr. Widmark, I think we can safely say he did pretty darn well." This is the end of Richard Widmark, Life Not Imitating Art. Please check out some of my other podcasts and subscribe to receive new podcasts. And again, please check out my blog for video clips that go along with these podcasts. Simply type in a search, Classic Film, Montgomery, Clift, and other great actors. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you at our next podcast.